The film opens with the funeral of Darren Shan, a teenager whose apparent death has left everyone in mourning. However, a shocking twist reveals that Darren is actually alive and playing video games inside his own coffin. The story then jumps back in time as Darren recounts his seemingly perfect life. He was well liked at school, had great grades and cool friends that made his parents proud. The only issue was his childhood best friend, Steve. One day, Steve persuades Darren to skip their history class and join him on the school rooftop. Steve begins throwing stones at light bulbs, challenging Darren to do the same. Unfortunately, their history teacher overhears the commotion and catches them in the act. As a consequence, both boys are caught and their parents are informed. Darren bears the brunt of the punishment, as his parents had always believed him to be an ideal student. They scold him severely, ground him for 2 months, and forbid him from associating with Steve, whom they deemed a bad influence. The following day, while on their way to school, Darren reveals to Steve that his parents want him to end their friendship. Steve is devastated and accuses Darren of never standing up for himself. As they argue, a limousine drives by, and a man inside tosses out a flyer that lands in front of them. The flyer advertises a circus event called a freak show, which claims to only happen once every 500 years. Despite their teacher warning them against attending due to its illicit nature, the boys decide to go anyway. Later that night, Darren and Steve sneak out of their homes and ride their bicycles to the circus. It's revealed that the boys have unusual interests. Darren is a spider enthusiast, while Steve is obsessed with vampires. At the circus, they buy a ticket from a small human-like creature hiding behind a curtain. However, when Steve hands over the money, the creature bites his hand and scurries away. Despite the odd occurrence, the boys brush it off and enter the theater. The audience is a diverse mix of age groups, mainly consisting of adults and the elderly. The performance begins, and the host, Mr. Tall, takes the stage, expressing gratitude to the audience for attending. He then presents a series of bizarre freaks. The first act features a wolf man, whose presence terrifies the crowd. Mr. Tall guides him towards a woman in the audience, and to everyone's dismay, the wolf man tears off her hands. However, before anyone can react, the woman's hands regenerate, and she calmly walks towards the stage. Mr. Tall then introduces her as Korma Limbs, a member of the freak show. Next is Alexander Ribs, a man with no discernible ribs. Gertha Teeth is the third performer, who surprisingly can break anything with her powerful teeth. Ramus Tobiles, her partner, can eat anything thanks to his 2 stomachs. He even swallows a tricycle whole and spits it out in one piece. Later, a stunning freak named Madame Truska invites Darren onto the stage to be her assistant. However, upon touching his face, she senses something forbidden within him and pulls away. As the performance continues, Madame Truska impresses the audience by growing facial hair in an instant. After Korma Limbs act, she abruptly calls for the show to be ended. However, Larton Crespley, the next performer, takes the stage with his spider partner, Octa. He impresses the audience with a dance performance while playing an instrument. Steve recognizes Larton from a book about vampires and whispers to Darren that he is actually a vampire named Verhoston. Suddenly, the show is disrupted by the police and townspeople, including the boys' history teacher. While the adults argue, Darren sneaks backstage and steals Octa, fascinated by its colorful appearance. But as he attempts to leave, he is forced to hide when someone enters the room. To his surprise, Larton appears with an old man, discussing the threat posed by a group of hybrid vampires known as the Vampinaes. In a moment of desperation, Steve barges in and begs them to turn him into a vampire. He reveals that his father has been missing for a long time, and his mother is an alcoholic. After a lot of persuasion, Larton eventually gives in and decides to taste his blood. However, as soon as he puts it into his mouth, he realizes that Steve is a bad person. Consequently, he refuses to turn the boy into a vampire, prompting him to storm off in anger. Larton notices that his spider is missing, but before he can investigate, Darren panics and flees. Darren is later picked up by the same card he saw earlier and is interrogated by 2 men, Merlot and Mr. Tiny. However, they soon realize they have the wrong person and drop Darren off at his home, informing him they will stay in touch. Darren takes Octa to school the next day, hoping to keep her safe. But Steve spots them before the class starts and starts playing with Octa. Unfortunately, he accidentally drops her on the floor, and instead of catching her, he chases after her with the intention of killing her. This causes chaos in the school hallways, with many students running away in fear and some even getting injured. Octa decides to take matters into her own hands and bites Steve on the cheek before escaping through the window. Steve falls to the ground and gets knocked unconscious due to the venom. Darren rushes back to the circus to plead with Larton to help save his friend's life. Larton is worried about the consequences if a human finds out about their existence and initially refuses to help. However, he eventually agrees to provide the antidote under one condition. Darren becomes his assistant vampire. This means leaving his family, friends, social life, and giving up going to school. In short, he will have to die. Despite the risks, Darren, desperate to save his friend, agrees to the terms and receives Larton's vampire blood. After rushing to the hospital, Larton administers the antidote to Steve just in time, saving his life. Days later, Darren starts to feel the effects of Larton's vampire blood, including a strong craving for raw meat. One day, he even has an intense desire to drink his sister's blood, but manages to resist and runs to his room instead. Larton warns Darren that he needs to leave home to protect his family from his dangerous urges. After almost attacking his sister, Darren decides to fake his death and disappear. Larton helps him by breaking his neck on the rooftop of their house. This makes everyone believe that he accidentally fell. The movie then cuts to the present, at Darren's funeral, where his loved ones mourn his passing, unaware that he is alive, and well inside the coffin playing games on his phone. That night, Larton digs up Darren's grave and rescues him from the coffin. However, their escape is interrupted when Merlot suddenly appears and attacks them. With his fighting skills, Larton manages to fend him off and temporarily subdue him. After the close call, they seek refuge in the freak show campgrounds, where they meet Rebecca. Meanwhile, Steve is consumed by grief over his friend's death and withdraws from society, becoming increasingly unhinged. As Steve struggles with unbearable pain, he considers ending his life. But before he can act, Mr. Tiny intervenes and speaks to Steve about his deep interest in vampire lore. Mr. Tiny offers Steve the chance to become a Vampanese, a different breed of vampire who feeds on humans, unlike Larton and his kind. Steve learns that Vampanese and regular vampires are sworn enemies who hold vastly different views on how to coexist with humans. As Steve absorbs the shocking news, Mr. Tiny reveals that Darren is still alive and thriving in another realm, something that Steve had always longed for. Despite feeling furious at the news, Steve accepts Mr. Tiny's offer without a second thought. Darren gradually adapts to life in the freak campground and helps others with their tasks. He even begins to train himself and develop his skills. One day, Darren decides to call Steve after looking at old photos from his past. However, Larton appears and takes away his phone, destroying it. Later that night, Mr. Tiny arrives at the freak camp to speak with Larton and Mr. Tall about Darren's unique abilities. Mr. Tiny asks them to hand Darren over, but Mr. Tall diplomatically declines, despite their long-standing enmity. Larton warns Darren not to leave the camp, as it is no longer safe for him. Larton begins to train Darren so that he can defend himself if necessary. Initially, Darren struggles to even lay a finger on Larton, but as he continues to train, he becomes stronger and more skilled. Meanwhile, Merlot transforms Steve into a powerful Vampanese, which also amplifies his evil tendencies. Steve's first victim is his own history teacher. As Darren's hunger grows, he begins to crave fresh blood. Larton takes him to a nearby farm, where he sedates a man, explaining that vampires never kill, only borrow blood. Despite his hunger, Darren cannot bring himself to do it, so they return to the camp. Suddenly, the peaceful campground of the freaks is invaded by ruthless Vampanese. Chaos ensues as the two sides engage in a brutal fight, resulting in a lot of bloodshed. It becomes clear that the Vampanese are searching for Darren, and they find him hiding with Rebecca in a costume room. A fierce brawl breaks out as the Vampanese attack Darren. Fortunately, Larton, Mr. Tall, and the other freaks arrive just in time to break up the fight and save Darren from certain doom. However, after the dust settles, it is revealed that Merlot has kidnapped Rebecca. The next day, Darren sets out to find Rebecca and his family, feeling guilty for what happened. Meanwhile, Mr. Tiny kidnaps Darren's family to lure him into a trap. Upon returning home and finding it empty, Darren discovers a flyer inviting him to the circus. Larton decides to join him and gathers his weapons. At the circus, Darren finds Rebecca and his family tied up on the wall, shocked to see Steve fighting alongside the Vampanese. Despite his weakness from not drinking blood, Darren fights Steve, while Larton engages Merlot. Rebecca frees herself and offers her blood to Darren to regain his strength. Initially reluctant, Darren eventually accepts her help after she assures him that she will be fine. In another part of the circus, Larton sustains severe injuries, but manages to summon the last of his strength to fatally wound Merlot by stabbing him in the heart. Meanwhile, Darren and Steve continue their intense fight as Mr. Tiny observes from a distance. Finally, Mr. Tiny intervenes and resurrects Merlot by transforming him into a dwarf creature. He then invites the boys to come with him, but Steve is the only one who agrees, impressed by Mr. Tiny's extraordinary power. Darren, on the other hand, refuses. After the showdown, Larton hypnotizes Darren's family to erase their memories of the recent events. This way, they won't remember any supernatural occurrences. The movie concludes with Darren returning to the freak camp, where he receives a warm welcome from all the freaks, making him feel at home once again.